Thank you, my brothers and sisters, for joining me again for 1 Peter. Please let me read to you 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 to 21. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if, when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you might follow in his steps. This week, slavery has been pretty much in the air, or at least on the television. In the Roman Empire, one person out of every 5 was probably a slave, and in the cities, Rome, Carthage, Milan, that would probably come down to being something like 1 person in 2. Slavery wasn't always bad. Sometimes it was a safe place to be. But the writers of the New Testament do not try to abolish slavery, but to change it. They realised that to proclaim the gospel both to free men and to slaves was to bring about a transformation of slavery. That's why when Onesimus, the runaway slave, becomes a Christian, he will be in an entirely different relationship now with his master. Now they are, in some sense, brothers in the Lord Jesus. And this was typified particularly at the beginning of the 3rd century, where Perpetua, a young free woman, was condemned as a Christian and put to death in Carthage. But she goes to her death embracing a slave girl, also a Christian, also condemned, Felicitas. So that is how slavery was broken down by Christians in the early centuries of the Christian church. When we come to this passage, we need to grasp a couple of things. First, in verse 18, we're told about the Christian slave at work. Let me draw attention to the fact that he's to do his work with fear, with due respect to the ESV translation I read. Fear really is not fear of their master and therefore respect, so much as the fear of God, which Peter has commended in verse 17 of this same chapter, 1 verse before. So a slave operates with the fear of God, if he is a Christian, and like a Christian in every other situation, he willingly submits himself to obeying the authority in that situation. And, says Peter, he does this if his master is a good one, kind and gentle, the very words incidentally used to describe the Lord Jesus in Matthew 11. Or if he is, ESV says unjust, the Greek word is skolios, which means doubled over, bent over, not very nice. And that's how a Christian slave works, says St. Peter. But the second thing Peter goes on to say, is being a slave could involve suffering. The word Peter uses for suffering is a Greek word which means to hit you so hard that it leaves a bruise. Peter says, if you endure suffering when you are clearly wrong, in verses 19 and 20, then that is just right and proper, and it's no credit to you as a person. But, he goes on to say, if you determine to live as a Christian and to behave as a Christian, and you suffer for it, and you are beaten again, let me remind you of the word. It means to be really, really seriously hit hard. Then, says Peter, God approves of your taking that punishment without blame, without retaliation. So Peter has moved from slaves to a thing that is good for all Christians. How does he come to do that? Well, this brings us to the third point, and that's in verse 21. So we've moved from the Christian slave at work to the Christian slave in trouble, and now we move to the Christian slave in good company. Why does God approve of a Christian slave being beaten when he stands up for God, when he lives God's way, and yet his master beats him? Because, says Peter in verse 21, you were called to this. This is one of Peter's favourite words that describe the Christian life. We were called out of darkness into his marvellous light in chapter 2, verse 9. Or in chapter 5, verse 10, God has called us to his eternal glory through Christ. But part of our calling to be Christians means to identify with the Lord Jesus even when there is suffering of some sort attached to it. How did we come to be called to a thing like this, you might ask? Peter goes on to say, because Christ also suffered for you, so that before he goes to the cross, Jesus is also beaten. The same word which means to leave a bruise or a black eye is used of Jesus' suffering in Matthew 26, Mark 14. Christ also suffered for you, and then he does an incredible thing. He jumps from there to saying that when he did so, he left a pattern for us to follow. The word Peter uses is the stencil that a boy took to school to learn how to trace out nicely formed Greek letters. You ran your finger through the stencil. Peter says, Jesus, by the way in which he faced suffering, leaves a pattern for us as we face suffering. As we face suffering, not something we deserve, but when we are ridiculed or made feel small or denied promotion because we live as Christians, this is the pattern of life to which God has called us. So next time people think us odd, we are not to try to defend ourselves, but we are to remember that Christ also suffered and left a pattern for us. This is a hard thing. I don't like it when a school child says, "Sir, I don't believe in God," and looks at you as if you are a bit stupid. And you don't like it when similar things happen to you. But we need to grasp that when these things happen, we are standing in a really hallowed place. And this, says Peter, is part of our Christian calling and life. God grant us, in our world full of ease, to grasp that and not to shrink from it.